Coming up.
I suppose now might be a good time for a spoiler alert for anyone watching at home. But, Professor, do central banks serve the people?
Talked about the peril of labeling climate action as woke. And I just was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about that. We've seen conservative politicians label climate action as woke.
A few minutes ago, you said that we need to actively turn off the taps of oil and gas financing. Would it be correct in saying that that is the whole goal and that is the whole purpose of the taxonomy system of the central bank?
Like and subscribe.
We have with us this morning...
Chair, just a point of order.
Yes. We have a point of order from Mr. Mazer. One moment, please.
Just wondering, there's been multiple requests from the parties getting Mark Carney here to be a witness at this study. So have we heard back from Mr. Carney at all?
I haven't personally, but maybe our team here has. Have we heard back from Mr. Carney?
He's available in October.
He's available in October, apparently.
He plans on coming?
Well, I believe so. Well, we're going to have a steering committee at 3:30. We can discuss all of these potential witnesses.
That's not a point of order. That's for in-committee work. I think that's...
Yes, that's
where
why I said we'll discuss in steering.
In camera.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vancouver. Okay, so we have with us Peter Deutsch, professor at the University of Victoria. We have, who's testifying as an individual. We have from the Canadian Climate Institute, Jonathan Arnold, acting director, Clean Growth. And from the Carbon Tracker Initiative, we have Mr. Michael Coffin, head of oil, gas, and mining.
Professor Deitch from the University of Victoria, I read with interest your book entitled, or that you co-authored, entitled, Do Central Banks Serve the People? I suppose now might be a good time for a spoiler alert for anyone watching at home. But, Professor, do central banks serve the people?
Yes, they do, but we can always do better. So this is a very good question to reframe what I said earlier. So central banks' main mandate today in most countries is a narrow mandate of price stability, and for a long time, I would say for most of the post-war period, that was a good mandate because what central banks did to promote price stability did not have too many unintended side effects on other policy objectives. Now, with the financial crisis and with the COVID crisis and with the new instruments that central banks have been employing, there have been more unintended side effects of these policies on other policy fields, including on wealth inequality and on the climate. And so that's why we're in a position where I think we have to rethink how the interaction between what central banks do and what other parts of government do interact. So what I've tried to show earlier is that something that happens under the supervision of the Bank of Canada, namely bank lending, actually throws a wrench in the green transition. And I think that's something that we need to A, realize, and 2, act upon.
Professor, in your book, you talk about a lack of transparency at central banks and the lack of response to criticism that central banks take. Can you elaborate on these points a little bit?
So, it's tricky because what central banks they do today is watched by by financial markets, and every word is put on the scale. And so the official communication of central banks is relatively restricted. They have become more transparent, but one of the aspects that we criticize in the book is that there is no open political debate about the substantive issues about what central banks do and what the unintended side effects are. So if you look again at the concrete point that I made earlier, the fact that the Bank of Canada in our case implicitly accepts all the lending by commercial banks in Canada is not something that is widely discussed as a political issue.
Bank of Canada were to adopt this taxonomy system, and after some time there are problems with the system that need to be corrected. How do we avoid some of the problems that you identified in your book with the lack of response to criticisms and the lack of willingness of central banks to correct their past mistakes?
I think there's good models in the past and in the present for how to do these things. So, for instance, in Asian countries, there's much more coordination between governments and central banks. In the past, in countries such as Canada or in European countries, there was much more coordination between what the government does and what the central bank does. So today we've got a very strong independence framework, and there are justifications for that. So we have to be careful in tinkering with the system that we have, but at the same time, the unintended side effects, in this case on the climate, are becoming too important to ignore them.
In this
Sorry,
parliament...
I can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is my microphone on now? Okay,
Yes.
very good. So there has been an idea debated in this parliament that central banks and the Bank of Canada should be subject to audits by the Auditor General's office. In your opinion, Professor, would this offer a greater degree of transparency for the Bank of Canada if it moves forward with this taxonomy system?
Look, the devil's in the detail. There are many ways to implement this coordination that I talked about. I'm not going to endorse one over the other at this point. What I'm arguing is that we need this coordination so that the right hand of the government doesn't undermine what the left hand does. Right now, we've got a commitment to climate goals, and what I've tried to show is that central bank action, or what happens under the supervision of central bank action, actually throws a wrench in the green transition. So that's what needs to be addressed. There's many ways to do it.
Okay, thank you. Chair, how am I doing for time? A minute left. Okay, so maybe I'll switch gears to Mr. Arnold from the Canadian Climate Institute. Mr. Arnold, what would happen to the rates of return of pension funds and mutual funds if chartered banks focused less on rates of return and more on complying with the taxonomy system provided by the Bank of Canada?
You have 30 seconds for a response.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Some of the research that we've done in this area suggests that financial institutions may be investing in green and transition assets at a lower level than what they would otherwise because of the lack of standardized information. So this is actually not about changing or modifying the mandate of financial institutions like pension plans, who are still going to have a fiduciary duty to the customers that they
We'll have to
represent.
stop there, yeah.
Most people agree with the notion that runaway carbon emissions are largely responsible for climate change and extreme weather, and understand that oil and gas producing nations like Canada need to reduce our emissions. All industries in Canada have demonstrated some progress, except Canada's oil and gas sector. Higher emissions are being driven primarily by oil sands and bitumen production in Alberta. And despite that, Conservatives seem to be of the opinion that Canadian emissions are somehow exceptional, more ethical, or less damaging to our environment. My question is whether or not that is compatible with the science, and if you believe that pricing pollution is one way to reduce our emissions. Professor Dietsch, I'd start with you.
So the simple part of the question first, I think, yes, that's what the science shows, is that the carbon emissions are causing harms from health outcomes to premature deaths in Canada, et cetera, climate events. And the economics shows that this is already more costly than profitable. It's just the question of who bears the costs, right? So I agree with you that a first best solution would be to internalize those externalities and have higher prices on carbon emitting activities. But I think we also need to work on the financial system, and that's why I try to outline what's going on there in terms of the bank lending. Thanks.
Mr. Arnold?
Yes, thanks for the question. To start with the last part of that first, yes, carbon pricing is fundamental, and the research of the Institute has shown that the industrial carbon pricing system in Canada has driven the bulk of emissions reductions in the country. That would include emissions reductions from industrial sectors, such as oil and gas, although, as you mentioned, emissions continue to go up. Carbon pricing plays a role there, certainly, but there are other complementary policies as well that we've looked at, including more stringent methane regulations, a cap on oil and gas emissions, as well as other market-based policies. And this, I think, gets back to the idea of a taxonomy. We've laid out a framework for how investments in oil and gas might meet the label of transition under very stringent requirements. We put out a paper on that last year, but essentially it would require commitments at a corporate level to net zero with clear, credible transition plans, as well as at the asset level, having an emissions curve that aligns with net zero. So it's a high bar, but not impossible. And that's the type of policy that we see as necessary to bend the curve.
There's been a lot. If you'd like me to repeat the question, I'm happy to.
So I think I heard I missed the audio cut out in the first part. I'm happy with the question. Yeah.
Okay, great. All I was asking was the preface of the question was about how most industries in Canada have demonstrated progress in lowering their emissions. I gather from your intervention that you agree that carbon emissions are driving climate change and extreme weather. And my question directly was whether or not Canadian emissions from Canadian industry are somehow exceptional or more ethical or less damaging, thereby leading to the very common conservative notion that we ought to drive industry, oil and gas in Canada because our emissions are somehow better than other countries. Does the science back that up?
30 seconds, please.
Well, I mean, I'd support the comments of the other two witnesses. What I would say is, so no, Canadian emissions are in no way exceptional in that regard. And I think I'd make another point. Ultimately, the energy transition is about moving away from oil and gas. So in some ways, decarbonising it doesn't really make sense. It's about reducing the volume of production and the consumption over time. And so you need to decarbonise consumption sectors, but actually for the energy supply sector, you need to move away from oil and gas.
Thank you, Madame Poulsey.
On the taxonomy piece, we've heard concerning rumors about the government's potential intention to include LNG, a fossil fuel, in the kind of sustainable finance taxonomy, and labeling that a fossil fuel as sustainable finance. Can you tell us your thoughts or reflect on that?
Yes, and this is a concern that we take very seriously in the work that we do and have done at the Institute. And as I referenced earlier, we published a paper earlier this year looking at what types of requirements might need to be true in order for an oil and gas asset to meet that transition label. And it is an extremely high bar. As I said, it would require commitments at the corporate level to have net zero targets that include Scope 3 emissions, which none currently do. And at the asset level, it would require significant investments in new technologies to drive down emissions to get on a net zero pathway. So we see that it is possible, but the framework that we've laid out would make that an extremely high bar, and there would need to be significant change within the industry and at the corporate level and at the asset level for that to happen.
You have about 15 seconds for a comment.
Maybe just asking the other two witnesses kind of a yes or no?
This is like
just a yes or no around including
yes or no. Yeah, sure.
LNG as a sustainable finance within a taxonomy.
Yeah, yes or no.
Be a clear no from me.
Okay, that's good and succinct.
No from me.
Okay. For that. Okay.
To move more quickly towards a green translation, we have all of the resources we need to fully develop to their full potential. And if we do so, we will be well served. And then we also have to work hand in hand with First Nations to develop this potential. Certainly in Indigenous lands, those concepts, those ideas have been repeated by Mr. Poilievre, and again, he was discussing this last year. My first question is for Mr. Arnold. Mr. Arnold, you said earlier, in fact, I was quite pleased to see that you were referring to solar and wind. If we make a great deal of effort to speed up the green effort in wind, hydro, geothermal, nuclear even, would Canada come out ahead if we were focusing on these green energies? We have to speed these things up, don't we?
Absolutely, yes. But speeding that up requires stringent policy in multiple different ways. So I referenced the industrial carbon pricing system. The consumer carbon tax also plays a role. Clean fuel standards will play a role. All of the other policy initiatives that I mentioned in my opening statement around disclosure, taxonomy, and transition plans will all play a role. This will not happen without a significant lift from policy and ramping up the different types of policy we have today, and then also introducing new policies to keep bending the emissions curve down.
Professeur Dietsch, vous avez dit tout à l'heure qu'il faut...
Professor Dietsch, you were saying investments need to be made. Last year, the federal government decided to announce close to $18 billion in direct grants. $18 billion for one single project. Could we have used these funds for another source, for another purpose?
Alors, j'ai pas vraiment dit qu'il faut faire des...
I wasn't saying we needed to invest. I was saying we need to pull away from the fossil fuels sector's investment. There are a number of ways of doing that. I have 15 seconds, so I'll stop there.
The Conservative Party likes to say that this is the problem, is that we're not investing sufficient in technology and that this will solve our problems. I'm just wondering if you could comment on this and whether you think that investing in technology will be sufficient to help us meet our net zero, or in fact, on its own, meet our net zero targets. Perhaps we can start with Mr. Arnold.
Yes, technology will certainly play a role, but policy is a huge foundational piece to driving the incentives toward more innovation and research and deployment, frankly, in those technologies. Canada has a swath of extremely innovative, small, clean tech companies, but we have a very hard time commercializing because we are a small market. Mm-hmm. So there are very well-targeted policies to help those small technology companies deploy and commercialize things like the Canada Growth Fund, for example, to really help keep businesses in Canada. If you look at the most successful technologies out there in terms of climate change.
Sorry, Mr. Arnold, I don't have much time,
Yep,
so I just
sure.
wanted to ask one follow-up question on that. Do you think that without a carbon pricing or a price on pollution, that these investments are going to be attractive to investors in this technology? Or do you think that internalizing rather the externalities is necessary in order to get the sufficient investment in actually transitioning to a green economy?
Yeah, internalizing the externality of greenhouse gas emissions is fundamental to solving the problem. And there are also a range of other complementary policies that we've talked about, but carbon pricing is and should be the foundation of a credible, strong approach on climate policy.
Thank you very much. And I had another question. When the 5 major bank CEOs were at committee recently, I asked each of them directly. They talked about their transition plans, about how they were invested in the reaching net zero targets. And I asked them if any of them were willing to commit to only financing oil and gas company projects that either reduced or were neutral in terms of adding to greenhouse gases. None of them were willing to commit. And I'm wondering if you can comment on whether you think it's possible to reach our net zero goals if oil and gas companies continue to increase production and Canadian banks continue to finance this increase in production.
You have about 15 seconds, so if you could be succinct, that would be great.
I mean, just by arithmetic, no, that is not possible. Oil and gas emissions represent about 25% of Canada's total emissions, and that's just the upstream Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So, no.
You, in your initial comments, talked about the peril of labeling climate action as woke. And I just was hoping that you could talk a little bit more about that. We've seen Conservative politicians label climate action as woke. And what risks to the Canadian economy, to the Canadian financial system do we face if we engage in that kind of culture war?
Sure. I mean, I think the first point was to say that it was very much that climate, the risk of climate change are financial as well as physical. And as I outlined, there are the transition risks that impact, for example, the oil and gas sector, particularly in Canada. So as global demand falls for oil and gas, particularly for transport fuels, that creates a big problem to that. So by ignoring that transition risk, you are ultimately ignoring the financial headwinds facing that industry and the potential to significantly overinvest into new projects and new production that ultimately fail to deliver a financial return to investors and the stakeholders, and continue through the use of those fossil fuels, continue to take the world beyond climate limits, and thus pose a cost through the externality associated with the carbon emissions. And so, by failing to take account of that, it ultimately is failing to take account of the financial risks, and ultimately is bad for all. And it crucially, it's failing to recognise the systemic nature of climate change and the fact that it will impact all sectors.
Thank you,
Professor Deitch. A few minutes ago, you said that we need to actively turn off the taps of oil and gas financing. Would it be correct in saying that that is the whole goal and that is the whole purpose of the taxonomy system of the central bank?
So this is an important point. There's two ways that central banks think about climate, right? So one is, to what extent does climate impact finance? And the other is, to what extent does finance impact climate? Central banks across the world have come a long way in thinking about how climate impacts finance, right? They are encouraging commercial banks to look at their exposure to risks and so on. So basically, when climate considerations undermine price stability or financial stability, the central banks are on it. In the other direction, it's not the case, right? So what the financial sector does, and this is what I laid out earlier, when the financial sector acts in a way that slows down climate mitigation, central banks are not very proactive about that part of the equation. And I think that's an important part of the equation.
Yes or a no?
Sorry, I did not hear the follow-up.
So was that a yes or a no? Like, why does the central bank have to do the taxonomy if not to cut off the financing to oil and gas companies?
Well, it is acting to the extent that it poses a risk to price stability and financial stability, but not further than that. So it would be a yes and no. There's no binary answer to that.
Okay, let me move on to Mr. Coffin. Mr. Coffin, you spoke quite negatively earlier about carbon capture and storage. If you have, say, a public utility that has a coal-burning power plant, and the public utility wants to put a carbon capture and storage system onto the coal plant so the CO2 doesn't go off into the atmosphere, it goes under the ground. Why would that be a bad thing? Why would that be something that you would not support?
I think there's a number of reasons. One, carbon capture and storage has been around for a while, but has not been proven to be commercially viable at scale. And actually, this total sum of CO2 captured and fully sequestered on geological timeframes is very limited. The second part is, what is the cost of doing that? And would it actually be cheaper to substitute that coal power generation with renewables, whether that's wind, whether that's solar, whether that's other form of generation? And particularly if that is then that CCS is being subsidised through state or public funds, actually either economic diversification or helping support the transition towards a greener system, that money would be better spelt rather than just on CCS.
Mr. Ali.